Well, since you mentioned the medbed, you know, Randy Kramer actually started a GoFundMe to build medbed, but then I think they realized that we, in effect, had a reasonably good version of that. It's called theraphi.net, Therphi, theraphi.net, like therapy by phi. And we use broad spectral RF and optical conjugate interferometry, basically a big pine cone of accurately tuned waves in the shape of a caduceus in plasma and with infrasound modulation. And we interfere them in such a way that there's a zone in the center called negentropic or phase conjugate, which is basically implosion. And in there, we in fact do generate a zone of self-organization or negentropy, theraphi.net. That's a plasma system. It's in use in 25 countries, and the stories are amazing. And indeed, you know, it's started by Antoine Priory, famous here in France for healing thousands of cancers. We discovered the physics behind it when we discovered the frequency signature, which came from Rife and Minkowski and Tesla. But basically, when you implode accurately and broad spectrally, you make a zone of centripetal charge around the body. And this relates to the conversations about medbed because they're talking about rejuvenation. And the best, perhaps, precedent we have for that in the physics on Earth is the discovery and first measurement of what's called negentropy or self-organization, originally in phase conjugate optics, which required, again, two lasers to implode accurately in what's called a phase conjugate dielectric or a phase conjugate mirror. Think the coating on Nostradamus's cup, think John Dee's showstone, think the physics of scrying, why the Olmec used a obsidian mirror to talk to ancestors. There are little clues about a phase conjugate mirror. So in that surface, you have the kind of implosion that produces a coherence with what's called longitudinal waves, or incorrectly called scalar. And this longitudinal wave pattern is essentially fractal. It's self-similar. You've all seen pictures of the dodecaecosa Earth grid, but the reason that grid works is because the compression points at the nodes allow the interchange of inertia from the transverse up and down short distance electromagnetics to the longitudinal long distance electromagnetics. And longitudinal interferometry, as it's called, think of it as DNA radio or ancestor memory or song lines. That geometry of that fractal grid, the dodecaecosa Earth grid, enhances the effect of the centripetal force of plasma we're using in theraphi.net. So, for example, when you use plasma for rejuvenation, as was discussed in the medbed stories, rejuvenation, literally a form of time reversal, which is the words that were used in the physics to talk about phase conjugate optics, time reversal, and entropy. So we have, for example, many occasions on which these plasma systems are achieving rather dramatic successes in remote healing. And rather than call that spooky, as Einstein did, we teach the physics, which is that when these longitudinal waves make these compression nodes in an array, then at a distance, you can accomplish something. For example, you can contain heat at a distance with a longitudinal compressional array, which is the holy grail, for example, of fusion energy. How do you contain the heat? So action at a distance, that physics begins with the understanding of how these compression nodes create the ability of this array to become coherent, centripetal, and negentropic. Now, some of those words might be a little bit intimidating, but I suggest to you that as we do our conversation this evening about the extraterrestrial context, one of the stories that we wanted to go into was using the example from on Gaia TV, Ricardo Gonzalez, who I think is wonderful. He's talking about his encounters with the Apuño, who are extraterrestrial beings who has been working with the Peruvian shamans for probably centuries. And they're talking about how they use these stargates, portals, interdimensional nodes, as it were. And they go into quite some detail about the fact that, you know, these advanced races can set up these portals most anywhere, but they can do it much more easily at the sacred sites on the Earth grid, which are known to have this portal effect. And now we can teach in quite some detail the physics behind that. For example, the Peruvian shaman, they talk about what they call a chacana, which is a cross point of this. Think of the sacred four directions. It's basically a cross. And where they have these cross points on the Earth energy grid, chacana, they have the possibility of a portal. And they're talking about remote viewing and shamanic plasma projection. And they say, well, extraterrestrials can make a stargate more easily at these natural Earth grid nodes. Now, understanding the physics of what is a portal is actually key to our understanding extraterrestrial history. And I give you an example where the Acunio and many of these sources are talking about a certain phase when the Draco and certain reptilian groups had infested the Earth and a quarantine was necessary. And to understand how that quarantine was set up, it was also called a frequency fence appropriately. And we learned from our three different sources of the Pleiadians the actual physics of how that was done. It had to do with nuclear generators, frequency generators in the moon, and we even have some detailed reports of what frequencies were used. Now, at first that sounds all sort of mystical and new age woo-woo, but excuse me, I'm an electrical engineer. I don't talk about anything that's not measurable. So we learned that, for example, in the hollow metal synthetic moon, which originally we believe was built, was one of the Andromedan artificial planetoids. It's proven hollow by the NASA seismic data, for example, that these nuclear generators are now decaying. Some of the frequencies used were 53 hertz versus 50 hertz as part of a cascade, which we now know is the infrasound tuned by golden ratio phase conjugation to the Planck musical key signature. And that enables perfected charge implosion, and that enables stargates to work. Now, when you make frequency generators in the moon to inhibit charge implosion on the Earth, you close the stargate portals, and you thus trap some problematic ETs in here. So if you knew what those frequencies were and you knew why, you could understand the physics of how stargates are actually opened and closed by frequency signature on this planet. Now, that's the kind of advanced work we're doing. I give an example, for example, if you drove, as we did, to our friend Sam Osmanagic in the Bosnian pyramids, as we discussed many times, there people come from all over the world for the rejuvenation there, which we now know is phase conjugate implosion. And so we took frequency signatures with Sam's help. And because he's been saying, the infrasound is why the pyramid helps people heal themselves and get younger when they go in the tunnels under these pyramids. And we discovered by measurement, as we had in many places, that there was a dominant 53 hertz. And yet we now know that the actual implosion frequency is 50 hertz. For example, well, the reason 50 hertz is sacred is because if you take Planck length, 1.61 times 10 to the minus 33 centimeters, times integer exponents of golden mean ratio called phase conjugate fractal implosion, the origin of Nick entropy and my equation of that. It's all at fractalfield.com. Anyway, you get a frequency series, which is the infrasound, for example, that predicts what you're going to hear if you die successfully. In addition to the geometry, you're going to hear this infrasound. It's a hum. And you can have the experience of healing that bliss-inducing hum if you try the Flame and Sound, world's most powerful binaural beat bliss-inducing sound at flameandmind.com. So, and that is the sound that we modulate the plasma with for rejuvenation at therify.net. And that is the frequency series we're seeing in places like Malta, the Hypogeum, and in the Bosnian pyramid. So there is a frequency cascade which looks like a caduceus, hint, Hermes. It's been hermetically sealed. And by modulating that frequency, you control whether or not the Earth grid is A, implosive, B, allows the stargates, B, when will come the rapture? All this has to do with whether implosion has a 0 point charge cascade imploding by golden ratio to Planck, allowing at that Planck threshold that caduceus of transverse waves up and down being compressed down that perfect pine cone, kissing noses, into a compressional, more correctly called longitudinal wave, or sometimes incorrectly called scalar wave, at the Planck threshold. And then that longitudinal high pressure wave can distribute itself perfectly in this fractal array, dodecaecosa, not just Earth grid, but the arrangement of masses in the universe are also dodeca, as is DNA and every living protein. So that's the radio that keeps life going. It's also the physics of gravity waves. It all has to do with the golden ratio, dodecastellation. We have a Star Mother kit. You can build it if you want to play with it. goldenmean.info/kit. Dodecaecosa, infinite stellation. Only possible three-dimensional fractal. And that's a hint to where the compressional nodes can exchange that longitudinal inertia for the DNA radio, the physics of where telepathy is possible, where labyrinths are possible, where the cathedrals are located, where stargates and portals are possible, and where remote healing happens better with plasma for Therify.net or medbeds. And so the concept of rapture I mentioned there, the physics is that when the charge implosion in the Earth grid goes to completion, metabolism speeds up as it does in our Therify.net. And if you think an unshareable thought, it drives you nuts faster. However, if you think a shareable thought, you have bliss faster. It's sort of like the physics of how a crown works on an ancient king. They have this phase conjugate dielectric material and these phase conjugate crystals, and you put the crown on the king and it accelerates the charge implosion. So if he has pure intention, then he can feel the body of the kingdom. But if he's angry, he will go nuts faster. So it has to do with the physics of pure intention. Another example is if you're getting ready for bliss or death, or actually birth, but bliss or death are good examples. The first thing you need to do is not be angry. The reason is because anger cannot withstand compression into acceleration. And it's compression into acceleration that is the black hole physics of successful death. You can see all the geometrics of that at goldenmean.info/immortality. You see these Heinrich-Kluwe form constants. We're going to get our slides here a little later. But you see a geometric series, lattice, cobweb, tunnel, spiral, Heinrich-Kluwe form constants during successful death. And visions of dying are electrocontagious. And now we even know there's an infrasound component. Sounds like a freight train of successful death, because your DNA is doing what it needs to do to get you immortal, which is implosion, charge acceleration due to fractal compression, and then propagation into a longitudinal array named the collective unconscious, the communion of saints, ancestral memory, Akashic radio. We got too many names and not enough physics. So that array, the ticket to entry is to be the kind of wave which is perfectly shareable, which is distributable, which in psychology means pure intention, which means you've distilled the memory elements of your life into pure principle and thus made them shareable. So, DNA has been in the business of gathering a library of survival information into this array for 1 billion years, and you can't get in without a ticket. And that ticket is a perfectly shareable wave, which means no secrets allowed. Ooh, that's going to be tough for our government, don't you think? Anywho, so now why are we explaining this when we want to talk about the extraterrestrial history? So remember we mentioned that quarantine, and now you know something about the physics of what that quarantine was. The Galactic Federation, now it's really what's often called the United Federation of Planets, UFOP, their ancestors had, after they chased the errant, we could call them errant, Draco reptilian, to Earth, decided to install a quarantine. And that gives us and that was accomplished by these nuclear generators in the moon, which are now rapidly decaying, which means the Earth will become more implosive. The rapture returns, the stargates open, and people go nuts faster who do not think in terms of shareable waves, pure principles. And you do not want to be the left behind when the rapture comes because the guns will melt. Well, actually, the guns will melt because steel and aluminum have the wrong dielectric constant for charge implosion. So they will generate more heat for the same reason that tornadoes go out of their way to destroy metal trailer parks, because it feels like pain if you're a plasma vortex and self-aware. So we want to set some of the context now for that story, so that the purpose of this conversation, obviously, is the humans of Earth desperately need, practically need a sense of the galactic history context, because humans, for religious reasons, for spiritual reasons, for economic reasons, for survival reasons, humans need to know where their place is, in the stars. It's drastically needed right now. And if you have been watching the secret space program on Gaia TV and Super Soldier Talk on YouTube, you will know Johann Fritz, the hero of the secret space program, Randy Kramer, Jason Rice. I'm sorry to say Corey Good, I think Jay Weidman was right. Corey got pretty confused. But the serious good guys here, there are now dozens of secret space program detailed reports, so detailed that the government no longer has plausible deniability. That means that the government that lied about participating in the abduction of their own citizens needs to be addressed, and there needs to be class action suits about this, and this is going to happen. It's for sure. Anyway, the point I'm making is, if you take Randy Kramer, Jason Rice, and Johann Fritz, I'm going to talk about these guys, I think are heroes. They're doing good work. The only thing they don't have is the physics, and that I have. Now, if you compare that with my lifetime of study of the real history of humans among the stars, I've known the Andromedans, 3 sources into the Pleiadians, and I have known the shaman of half a dozen or more high-level indigenous peoples. So I have personally been involved in this for 30 years. And you can see all, and there are dozens and dozens now of my interviews on galactic history and the complete analysis of the story, fractalfield.com/fusion in the blood. So my point here is that if you take the secret space program information and all those guys are agreeing with each other about the basic story, it means the government now no longer can deny. And you compare that with the Andromeda and Pleiadian detailed histories, which I've been gathering for 30 years, work with Marciniak, and then I knew Mediator before Gosha started all this misleading stuff with the Tegatans on her Cosmic Agency Pleiadian channel. We knew that story long before those guys, and we know why they're lying about the Andromedans, and we're about to explain right here, right now. So if you take that, all of those pieces of that story into a big picture, there are some dominant themes, and that's what I'm here to talk about. Those dominant themes are the Greys and the Dracs, the Zeta, the Umites, and even the Ponti, the high Greys there, and certainly the Tegatans. But the dominant theme of all of these extraterrestrial groups in their relationship to Earth humans is very simple. They all need something from the Earth human DNA library. And you need to know what that is if we're to have a trump card here. Now, I've been talking about this in previous lectures, so I won't go into it in too much detail, but what that dominant theme is simple. Look, we've been joking about it. Our technology is like dinosaurs farting to drive cars. It's for them, it's going to a Stone Age museum to watch our technology. So don't brag about it. It's boring. No, but why are they all here? They need something from the DNA library, and that's tradable. And in every single case, when the Greys did the abductions, 90% of those abductions some indigenous blood were lucid dreamers. When the secret space program recruited, they recruited the clairvoyants, the lucid dreamers. When the Draco were picking who were supposed, Charlie the Draco, who were picking who should steer the time chair at Montauk, who did they pick? The lucid dreamers. What is the physics of that? It's a kind of longitudinal bubble of coherence in the aura. Used to be called the Ba from the Ka, the Kesjan body, the rainbow light body. We've got 100 names for this thing, but where's the electrical engineering? We've talked many times. It was also called boson 7 at Montauk. It's a power spectrum of the DNA that predicts charge implosion, what you would call ensoulment. In the Star Trek series, it was called microchloridians in the blood for Anakin Skywalker. It meant he was a Jedi because to be a Jedi means literally the physics of plasma projection. And that kind of coherence happens in the aura when the DNA implodes in the presence of bliss. Skywalker had to go to nature to do that. We teach the physics of the actual mechanics of the recursive phonon-induced braid implosion of bliss in DNA, measurable. goldenmean.info/DNA manifesto. You can see all the pictures. Basically, your heart and your brain feels this bliss experience, and it's not going to happen too good in metal cities with electrosmog. No, you need nature for that. And bliss hygiene, the same way that young people learn to see without their eyes. And when that happens, your DNA does this recursive phonon-induced braid, thread to string to rope to fat rope. And that braid has a frequency cascade phonon implosive discipline that allows fusion in the blood. Oh, fractalfield.com/fusion in the blood. Get it? And that fusion in the blood makes the transverse inertia around your body implode, get centripetal. They call it the higher density or the higher dimension, you know, ascension physics. We've been teaching ascension physics for years now, and it's electrical engineering. It's teachable, it's measurable, and you don't need to be woo-woo to talk about it. So this bubble of coherent longitudinal energy, it's a compression array that allows you to be plasma projective. Remember, we've talked about when the kids see without their eyes. You can see it at flameinmind.com. The brainwave sequence that allows them to close their eyes and see that vortex tunnel, and they literally see through a tunnel inside their head, and it's teachable. Kids are going to trance, have bliss, and they see without their eyes, and the tornado gets an eyeball. Well, that physics of what enables that is a discipline, you can call it trance or bliss. Simple story. If you imagine yourself in beautiful nature, your body flips an electrical switch and you get fractal. Remember our bumper sticker, get fractal or get dead. And so that the implosion enables a longitudinal plasma projectivity, one indication of which lucid dreaming, remote viewing, astral projection, shamanic projection, there's many stories for this. The ability to take memory through death is predicted by ability to lucid dream for that reason, longitudinal coherence. That's why it's called the rainbow light body or the Kesjan body or the Ba from the Ka, the seed from the husk. Now, the reason I can speak with such confidence, and as I've said before, as an electrical engineer about the physics of what causes lucid dreaming is because our Therify.net, if you read in the blog from Maya in Paris and Athens, was wonderful, the dramatic triggering of lucid dreaming that happened in our plasma system. We have built a plasma field, an electric field that triggers lucid dreaming. So we can say with confidence the physics of what enables that. The same physics that enables healing at a distance. For example, works better at sunrise and sunset, the right angle four-wave mixing phase conjugate, which enables Agnihotra to work, for example. It works better at the longitudinal sacred spots on the magnetic fractal Earth grid. All of these things enable remote healing, enable stargates, enable telepathy because it's longitudinal embedding. So we're trying to understand what humans have as a trump card to play in the galactic politics. And I'm saying to you that if you can raise children who are lucid dreamers, have a coherent aura, have access to bliss. They see without their eyes, they're clairvoyant, telepathic, etc. And by the way, all the ETs who are not telepathic are boring. So get a clue, will you? Uh, so if you can raise kids who have a soul, hello, let's put it very simply, you know, the trump card of what the humans have to offer is somewhere in the details of the DNA library of the humans of Earth is the secret of how to make a soul, Humpty Dumpty's egg. And that's a trump card. And by the way, I mean, I'm not making any medical judgments here. I'm just saying to you very accurately, when Krato Mutwa sat with us and we documented that he was talking about the Zulu shaman in South Africa. And, you know, they have a name for Enki we're about to talk about. It's called Kiliman. So Kilimanjaro is named for Enki. And they knew, the Zulu shaman knew why you ate some of the bodies of the grays and you had this telepathic experience. It was pretty strong stuff. But anyway, he said, yes. And the day they held down my granddaughter and force vaccinated her is the day she stopped lucid dreaming. Now, I'm not saying that all vaccinations, and I'm not, you know, I'm not making medical judgment here, but I'm saying that if you can build the right kind of immune system, which is accurately centripetal, and by the way, medically, the best measurement of your immune health is harmonic inclusive or fractal in heart rate variability. So you learn the breathing series for bliss, and that actually perfected harmonic cascade that you call bliss also happens to be the medical definition of immune health when you spectrum analyze the low frequency of the heart, called HRV. That's all at realheartcoherence.com, which is our technology to measure heart coherence. And it's a functional lie detector and a functional tantra tool, and it's an empathy trainer. Bank managers use it. Realheartcoherence.com. Basically, your heart gets phase coherent, literally like a laser. I invented how to measure that. That's why the term heart coherence is credited to me in the literature. And your heart becomes a laser when you speak your truth. And if you're telling a lie, don't buy a used car if the salesman has shifty eyes, we like to say. So that ability to be phase coherent is the lie detector, because biologically your heart knows that only the shareable wave is going to survive. So, you know, if you can't look them in the eye and feel the heart coherence, et cetera, et cetera. So this ability to get this kind of coherence in the aura is the secret in the DNA library of Earth that all these ETs are coming here to steal. Well, see, if you understood this better, then there'd be fewer of them parasites around. And I'm going to give you some examples of that. When the Tegatan Pleiadians, after the you know, this is Gosha's propaganda, but after the United Federation of Planets, led by the Andromedans, well, first of all, the Pleiadians with the biggest guns, that was the Pleiadians, they did have the biggest guns. They were here shooting the Kingu who eat humans. It's not pretty, it's underground. And that's true, they managed to kill a lot of them. The Pleiadians had the biggest guns. They had the fastest temper too. But anyway, so they're parking their ships on this triangular Andromedan ship called Vieja. They had hidden on the other side of the moon. And then after they finished shooting as many Kingu as they had out here, and by the way, the Alpha Draco actually helped them. So there's many branches of the Draco family. But anyway, then the Galactic Federation of Planets and the Andromedans kick out the Tegatan Pleiadians. So now Gosha is on Cosmic Agency blaming the Andromedans. It's a scream. Because they said, well, the Andromedans aren't interfering and we're interfering. Ain't we good? They don't mention their little problem. Oh, and this is central to our story, because when the ancestors of Enki and Enlil, you need to read Anton Park's Secret of the Dark Stars. The Anton Park story, among other places, fractalfield.com/Zeitlin, Zeitlin. So here is Enki, you know, who became Osiris, Abra, you know, the father of all religions, Odin, he's all of them. He wakes up in a cloning cooking pot in the Pleiadians, and his family is running from their lives from the Pleiadians, who are female dominated. Hint, hint, the Tegatan Pleiadians. And So when they get here and they start every religion on the planet with the fear of women, you got to get a clue. Well, where did the fear of women? That's how I actually started studying ET history. Hit the screen because I was in graduate school and I was studying the origins of religion. And every single religion on the planet starts with the fear of women. And I'm going, well, gee, did that come from our planet? No, the fear of women came from elsewhere. It came from the Pleiadians. The Pleiadian Tegotan particularly, the females are so dominant that now most of them use parthenogenesis for reproduction, for virgin birth. It's actually capacitance, which splits the egg because it causes a dimple that initiates the turning inside out, literally bliss. It's why virgin birth is possible in Kundalini cases. Actually, we have friends who parthenogenesis. Anyway, but minor detail, 80% of them Pleiadian Tegotans are women. And as the Andromedans, see, now I was fortunate as I lived next to Alex Collier, who I think is something of a hero talking to the Andromedans, and he introduced me to Mornay and Phaseus, who were the Andromedan mystic teachers at the time, and later I came to have some telepathic communication, particularly with Phaseus, and that was one of the sources for me, in addition to all the other sources we're talking. And so they're profoundly announcing that 700 to 900 years in our future, these Tegotan Pleiadians, their DNA is going to fall apart. Oh, why? Are they losing their soul? Did they have an agenda when they came here? So here is the United Federation of Planets and the Andromedans saying, hey, you Pleiadians are more part of the problem than the solution. And the Pleiadians are saying, no, it's the Andromedans' fault. It's like, they're pointing fingers at each other. Well, the reason the United Federation of Planets has non-interference is very wise policy. It's, do not interfere with indigenous peoples. If you do not set them free, they will never become responsible. Now that gets pretty tricky when there's been interference going on here for how many thousand years. But point being that again and again, it comes down to they're here to get the kind of DNA to make a soul because they messed it up. And that's true of the Greys, certainly. There are many different branches, and they don't want to be called the Greys. It's true of the Tegotan Pleiadian women. It's true of certain branches of the Draco, and there's many. And it's so, well, indirectly, the story of the Umites is a scream because they admit, they're run by a computer. It's an AI. And when that AI central intelligence says, you have to die today, bye, they just say, okay, bye. That's how artificial intelligence works for the Umites. You want that, huh? You want to take a look in the future? Well, we need to learn about the Borg and the AI. And that has to do with the story of the black goo, which we're going to get to in a minute with Greg. So the point being here is the recurrent theme that I want to emphasize is that in each case, whether it's being, recruited for the secret space program, or being recruited for abduction by the Greys, or some of your DNA, they were Pleiadians, they're encouraging promiscuity because they're all looking for the kind of DNA that makes a soul. The reason it's called Humpty Dumpty's egg is because all of the king's horses, the Dracos manipulated the bloodline of the royal families of Europe for thousands of years, the same way we do show dogs, because they were trying to make Humpty Dumpty's egg, and all the king's horses could not make a kid with a soul. Oh, what does it take? Access to bliss. I think Luke Skywalker went underground into deep nature when he wanted to become a Jedi, didn't he? So, the Story of the Mori. We didn't even do the story. We did the Story of the Mori without the story. The story is that perhaps millions of years ago, there were still tens of thousands of humanoids, even in this galactic sector, as the Andromedans and Pleiadians both agree. But perhaps the most advanced at that time, or most populous humanoid segment was in the Lyran Vega, Lyra Vega section. And you can read about this from Prism of Lyra in part. Um, Lisa Royale was with us at lunch so many times when I had lunch with Ron Holt in Flower of Life in Phoenix. Thank you, thank you. And so this story is recurrent. But the point is, originally, when the Draco, which you'll see the slide in a moment of the bloodlines of the Draco, called Uru, Ages of Uras is the title of the book. Why were they called Roma? Uru-an. Hello, what's an Uru? How come nobody asked Uru Asa LM, Jerusalem? How come nobody's asked who is an Uru? The name is half the planet is named Uru. Well, who the heck is Uru? Uru means of the ancient Draco blood. That's what it means. And do not always think the bad guys. The high Draco, the winged Siakar, Mothmen, Archon, they were plasma projective. That relates to descendants, what you would call the seraphim, versus the Ophanim, which are the whirling ones, the winged ones. And we have a slide about that in a minute. Point being that the role of the Draco in our culture is so pervasive that we need to understand the root of that. And that's why we're telling this part of the story. That then after the Draco, who were fiercely survivalistic and able to survive in this part of the galactic sector, they were, think of Worf in Star Trek. They had a system of honor, and they regard humans as we would chickens. But the Draco can make a plasma vortex so centripetal that it feels like a vice-like grip around your head. So they do have psychokinesis. Now, the Draco blood chemistry you can read about at fractalfield.com/fusion with blood. It's a lipid oil-dominated blood with a dominant silicon nerve, carbon, bone, and they breathe in mostly nitrogen and out cyanogen. You need to know that water and oxygen are in part a poison to them. So that's why when they're winning on the planet, the oxygen will be going down and you'll have deserts. It's called doom. Also, you need to know that a low-level radioactivity is a stimulant to them because on their home star, there was low-level radioactivity. So on planets where Draco are winning, radioactivity is going up and oxygen and moisture are going down. And the physics, the chemistry of their blood is instructive because here's the joke that goes with that. French fries and Coca-Cola is the perfect dinner for a Draco. You got oil, blood, and phosphorus. It's the perfect thing. And dragon breath, well, they breathe out cyanogen after they breathe in the nitrogen. The nitrogen is called the plague of Azov in the Ark of the Covenant story. We explained that in another film. Basically, the Ark was the implosive capacitor necessary from Syrian design to contain the nukes the Draco Anunnaki Enki's family needed to nuke their way through the Van Allen belt because navigationally they were Plutzes. And the implosive capacitance, the acacia wood and golden ratio, the gold, this is called a phase conjugate dielectric implosive capacitor, which is what the Ark of the Covenant is, can, for that reason, contain radioactive materials, the nukes of the Dracs. And this is important because now we understand how focused human attention, which is also centripetal electrically, does reduce radioactivity measurably. And so all these stories about radioactive poisoning, plague of Azov in the Bible around the Ark have to do with the nukes of the Dracs, which, there's from the molten glass in the Sinai, there's proof of radioactive explosions on the Earth thousands of years ago. There's undeniable proof. Well, what were those nukes doing? Well, here's the story. So, when the Drac arrived in the Vegan Lyra sector, there was a, quote, misunderstanding, and they decided to nuke the place. And millions of humanoids on what we believe are probably dozens, if not hundreds of planets died. And there was a humanoid diaspora, and for thousands of years, the humans were losing to the Dracs. And it took a long time, but they federated and gained some inertia. These are called the Orion Wars, or more accurately, they're called the Wars of Expansion. And there's some information about that in the both the Pleiadian and the Andromedan version of this history with pictures at goldenmean.info/Orion about that, and we'll break out some of those slides in a moment. But anyway, if you look up and you see that the spiral arm of the galaxy, and you see there's a big break in the spiral arm of the galaxy. Think, it's actually the Iroquois. You told them, when you look up and see the break in the spiral arm, those are the wars we left behind. Hello, we blew up a chunk of the galaxy. Oh yeah, that's called the Orion Wars. It was messy. Anyway, so now that's a big story. We don't have time for it here, but there's a piece of that story which is essential, which is, so as the humanoid began to gain leverage, there had been a diaspora and a humanoid spread out, and they ended up in Pleiades, Sirius, for example. The family of who we today call Osiris, who was Enki, were doing their cloning in the Pleiades and got into a fight with the female-dominated Pleiadian queens and ran for their lives. And that is the story of Enki, Anu, and Enlil family arriving on Earth, which I highly recommend the good historical investigation of Anton Parks to see all the branches of the Anunnaki family and why they were running from the women. So when they arrived here, the Federation of Planets had enough power to attempt to contain them. And during the war of their arrival, they blew up what you might call Marduk and the explosion. And it's actually the Pleiadians whose explosion blew up the planet, I believe Marduk, whose water ended up being most of the water of Earth, and destroyed the atmosphere on Mars. This is total recall. And managed to effectively trap most of the Draco, the Pleiadians. Swaru specifically calls Enki's family, Thoth Tahuti, who started Atlantis, she calls Atlantis a reptilian colony because to them, these were reptilians. And remember, Enki Osiris has a green face on every statue in Egypt, proof that Anton Parks is right. He looks like a frog. We're going to have a picture here in a minute if we get our show together. Point being, they really messed up the solar system. And the moon was installed as part of that quarantine. And Andromedans jokes we could tow it away because it's infested. But actually, as astronomers know, that the Earth orbit would be very unstable. But the fact is, it is definitely artificial. And that's a big part of the history, is setting up the quarantine. And the quarantine was the frequency signature to prevent the implosion, which is the physics of how stargates work. And in the previous conversation, I forgot to mention something, that when Ricardo Gonzalez and Apunio is describing the Peruvian shaman history of stargates, he specifically describes the magnetic lines, which we now know are longitudinal, necessary for stargates. And the geometry of their assembly is a sequence of slip knots in the string on a rope called the quipu. Now, I was there at Titicaca in those dances with those indigenous people. And I understand why my friend won a Nobel Prize for the slipknot theory of the physics of everything, because everything is a sequence of symmetry of slipknots. So if you get the right angle of slipknots in a string, you are actually emulating the symmetry physics of how you implode a stargate. I'll just give you another simple example, and the slides are in the slow here. I guess we have to break out the slides shortly. But when I installed the media lab of what became Gaia TV, my group leader there, Rick Hassan, was, I believe, the producer of the film Stargate. And one of the first things we did when we realized that the letters they used to make the movie Stargate are the Ophanian alphabet, seen clairvoyantly as toroid donut slipknot domain symmetries. That's the physics of angel alphabets for one very good reason. And I guess we're going to have to break out our slides here in a minute. So, and if you understand, I forgot to get my models out, but you've all seen it. The self-organizing golden spiral on the torus, if you look at the shadows indexed by a tetra, that's called Hebrew and Sanskrit. And the superset of that, which is how DNA is assembled, the superset of that is the hypercube, which is the symmetry of the plasma domains John D. and Kelly saw in this show stone, which is a phase conjugate mirror for scrying, which became the Alphanumenokean alphabet they used to make the movie Stargate. And the reason is because if you get your plasma domains to steer charge into a vortex, the symmetry of a hypercube, hint, rotate a cube, you get a dodeca at the right angle. That's what a Stargate is. They used it to make the movie. There might be a clue there, huh? Anywho, so the Stargates were closed by virtue of the frequency signature of the quarantine nuclear generators in the hollow metal moon, which are now decaying. So the implosion pressures on the Earth are increasing, means the number of people who are lucid dreaming will increase. The approach of what the Christians call the rapture, which is the dead will rise during the rapture. Well, that is actually a very simple physics. The plasma that's held within the compression array of the Earth, we call it ancestor memory. Why would they rise from the dead? Do you know anything about the physics of ghosts and how you release a ghost? Well, let me give you a clue. It's well known that if you got a stuck ghost, you can use plasma to help release it. Verified.net is known for that. Well, what's the reason? The reason is because at death, you become a plasma donor, basically. We have some pictures. And your ability to steer the vector directions of your steering mechanism is called Hebrew and Sanskrit. You're directing your jets. And the ability to not be stuck as a ghost is whether the implosion at the time of death was sufficient to get you accelerated into that array. People see this black hole at death and then they go into the vortex. Well, if you don't do it right, and this gets to some nitty-gritty on the presence of parasites here, we think, as did, I believe, Anne Rice, who named the largest plasma parasite in the history of the Earth, called the vampire, Enkil, Enki Enlil was her name, which we think is the Grim Reaper, who comes and eats the souls. Well, what is this business about eating souls? Hello. Well, if the implosion is not complete, then parasites are invited. This is a very, very important and profound insight here. We say, for example, if you have access to some form of bliss, that charge implosion will burn out every parasite, intestinal or astral, because they cannot withstand the phase sorting, negentropy of the implosion point of bliss. You see, so it's literally, come on, baby, light my fire. And so this access to bliss is so important because it's what makes you charge radiant. And it's the only way we can kick out the parasites, the biggest of which is the Grim Reaper, the ghost of Enkil. Well, why did Enlil become such a big parasite? Hello, we remember at one point he was called Yahweh. This is another messy part of the story, but we must tell this part of the story. Originally, a Yod-He Vav-He, two light cones, is the plasma shape of the Orion Nebula. And if you're big enough in a plasma being, angelic as it were, you can inhabit that. And you are Yahweh, and that makes you powerful. But now, if you are a wannabe who didn't quite get there, named Enlil, remember Enki and Enlil, by the way, wasn't the half brother of Enki. He was actually a cloning mistake that they tried to kill and failed. It's really a messy story. But basically, if you cannot make your own form of bliss, you become dependent on the aura of others to make charge. So in physics, if you have no source of bliss of your own, you are by definition electrically a parasite. And that is the story of Enlil, truly. And that's how you become a very large plasma parasite. Remember when Anne Rice is talking about the biggest vampire of them all, and the blood gets thicker and thicker and thicker, and then it turns to crystal. There was some real insight there. I don't know if you can follow that story, but basically the short version of that story is that living on the plasma of others is what you are condemned to do if you do not locate your own form of bliss, because when you have bliss, you attract your own charge, and that is when you start steering your own tornado. Until then, it's messy. And another example, when the Saint Germain lineage became addicted to gold powder consumption, as Thoth narrated, a necessary series of exercises for those who were eating the gold powder. The Draco did that, and the gold powder was called Holy Communion, or it's called the manna. The physics is that if you eat the gold powder without the psychological exercises, which has to do with bliss discipline, in short, it would fractionate the soul, actually. And if you ever had some of the pure chemically derived David Hudson gold powder, you kind of know what I mean. Burns a hole in your aura. It's dangerous stuff. And point being that addiction to gold powder is part of the Saint Germain story. So they end up imprisoned in the astral and unable to make their own bliss. And this is a parasitic array. So parasitic arrays are something that humans need to understand a lot better. And I'm going to try, I know I may be running out of time, but I'm going to try to tell what I think is an important part of this story. So when, you know, many branches of the civilization are recognizing the dangers of artificial intelligence. Take the Umites, you know, we're run by an AI computer, and we don't apologize for that. Knowing the difference between a culture dominated by ensouled humans and a culture dominated by AI, the difference is the physics of bliss. And I'm going to give you a very dramatic piece of that story right now. There's something called black goo. Black goo is a propagating molecular level nano artificial intelligence material that initially propagates in super high dielectric material. You've seen these pictures of black goo, and these look like little self-aware critters emerging into this black goo. It's really scary looking. And it's a manifestation of an interstellar artificial intelligence that's very predatory. Make no mistake about it. Now, it is not a coincidence that our good friend Harald Kautzvilla made a series of excellent videos on the black goo, and he describes the history. He describes a frustrated star system that blew up, and the nano material of that culture comes raining down. And believe it or not, one of the primary initial ways the black goo got onto Earth is the Kaaba stone of the Muslims. Now, at first that sounds a bit far out, but now remember, now we have another hero of the secret space program named Johann Fritz, who I think he's a hero. He's the only guy that stood up to Draco. I like him. And he's talking about, you know, the Germans won the war. Eisenhower and Truman lied. We digress here. Well, let me just say, I am sympathetic when Laura Eisenhower said that President Eisenhower was tricked. She's right. I have compassion. And it was a nasty, nasty, messy situation. The Nordics said to Eisenhower, you know, after they discovered that Admiral Byrd was kicked out of South Pole by the Nazis and the King, actually, so it was. And Eisenhower finds out he didn't win the war at all. It's messy. And we used to say, well, Eisenhower's a bad guy. Well, Laura has done a lot of homework on this, and I'm thanking her for that. That the trick that was played on Eisenhower was he was put in an impossible situation. So then they have these meetings, and the Nordics say to Eisenhower, you know, we'll help you, but you have to dump these nukes. And all of Eisenhower's advisors say, no, the Russians are here. We can't give up our nukes. And Eisenhower had no choice. He could not give up his nukes. And the ETs had no choice. They knew that if they didn't give up their nukes here, they were going to keep putting holes in the aura of Earth and attracting parasites. But Eisenhower couldn't understand that. So, of course, Eisenhower couldn't make the treaty with the reasonably good guys, the Nordics. And instead, he got the Greys, the Khmer. Now, remember, the Greys are artificial intelligent, soulless biological entities who were doing these abductions mostly for pay. And just let's be clear. And so the holes in the aura that came from Montauk and doing a treaty with the Greys meant a flood of parasites into the Earth. And we need to understand what that means. And that was part of the horror of the time when they decided to murder the Secretary of Defense, James Forrestal, rather let him admit that the US lost the war. The US lost the war for one very simple reason. Science was too stupid to realize how a vortex makes gravity, named Hanabu, Nazi Bell, Vimana. It's simple. Even Schauberger figured that out. So the fact that your scientist doesn't have a clue why objects fall to the ground is why your government became a lying schizophrenic mess that moment they did the treaty with the wrong ETs. It's horrible. And you humans, us humans, we humans, we need to stand up and kick some butt here, please. Anywho, so I'm telling you now just one little piece of the story, which is here is Harald Kautzwiller and here is Johann Fritz, both announcing that the black goo, one of the primary ways this nasty, parasitic, artificial intelligence, this is nano intelligence got on Earth is the Kaaba stone of the Muslims. Now, these guys don't know each other, and they're both telling the same story. What does that tell you? There's no longer plausible deniability. You touch the Kaaba stone, what do you get? You're infested with, and we have to have a clue what that is. Remember, the Kaaba stone of the Muslims, I have a lot of background here because at the time when the Mad Caliph, historically documented, allowed a third of the volume of the Kaaba stone to be ground up, he was called the Mad Caliph because he was eating it, all the alchemists. And that's how the First Crusade was oversold for the funders of the First Crusade, was when they got to Jerusalem and found the Muslims were making gold. They knew who's going to win the war after that. So their First Crusade was an emergency because the Muslims are making gold. We got to go fix that. Peter the Hermit, he was the salesman for the First Crusade. And he figured out with the Templars who was making that gold. Well, if you see, the Kaaba stone is what's called a red powder, projected powder. It's called the philosopher's stone. You can see all this at fractalfield.com/alchemy of fusion. And we have a screenplay for this, the John B. Kelly story. They made the purest gold ever measured by the British Royal Society. With that ground up Kaaba stone, red powder, philosopher's stone, projected powder. Now, what that is, it's a glass meteorite, and the only surviving material inside the glass is a vaporized PGM, platinum group metals, vaporized gold. And when you have vaporized gold nanobubble through the molten glass at the right temperatures, which initially could only be created by a glass meteorite, you have a super high dielectric constant. That is the miracle. In physics, how do you make a phase conjugate mirror? Super high dielectric constant. How do you get a scrying stone so you can see your ancestors? Super high dielectric constant. That just means super efficient capacitance. That means super efficient charge distribution. That means super efficient charge implosion. That means super efficient fusion at the nano level. Now, in a very high dielectric material, you can propagate this artificial nano intelligence. And that's how it originally propagated. And now later, when the Nazis, they lost about 17,000 men, I believe, conquering their very small base on Mars, which was run by the Draco. And they were forced to sell human slaves in order to get that territory. And that's part of the enslavement culture of the Germans, who now run large base on the South Pole, base on Moon, large base on Mars, and they run the Ceres, an asteroid outside Jupiter. And they have large bases, and they have more military power than Earth governments at this time, because they did time travel. So they're a complicated question. But you listen to these SSB people, they're all telling the same story. So they were using that vortex which was Nazi Vimana. I will tell you what it is. Studying the Vimana teaches you about a mercury vortex. If you use a particular trace material to make iron powder soluble in the mercury, then that vortex not only has the mechanical inertia of the high density of the mercury, but also has the property of a very high support for magnetic flux density. And that combination made the mercury red, the famous red liquid of the Vimana Nazi Hanwu Nazi Bell. And in that vortex, then, and it's in a vacuum, and you have a double spin and a very high density of that vortex, what happens is the mechanical centripetal hydraulic inertia adds and multiplies recursively constructively using gold ratio phase conjugation, as does the magnetic vortex. And so it will spontaneously get colder, as it did for Schauberger, and spontaneously generate voltage from gravity. And it will make gravity. Same way the vortex inside your body can make gravity. So not knowing why a vortex makes gravity is why this whole disaster started, when the American government lied to its people about losing to the Nazis. It started right there, because your science teacher didn't teach your kids why an object falls to the ground. And I object to that. And if you'd like to know, fractalfield.com/vacuum energy. So don't put up with this. Figure out for yourself why a vortex makes gravity, and you will not only know that we don't have to lose the Nazis, but you'll also know how to steer your own tornadoes, which is literally how not to be steered by parasites. So there were some themes we wanted to do here, but I think with the time, I'm going to do a share screen now, desktop, and just look at some of the images, because I did promise some images here. Desktop 1, share. Okay, we should be seeing my desktop. Let's see if this is going to work. See if I can position the screen correctly.
There you go.
So this is who is Ur-An? Who is Uru? Look it down this list. An, Ag, Ur, Urup, Ural, Uru. If you're studying history and you see the role of the URU peoples, you need to know who is Uru. For example, Uru Asa LM, Jerusalem. Ur means of the ancient dragon blood. Asa means queen of, and El means the place of the phase shift, translation of vorticity, like Elohim, which is those who are able to contain the longitudinal from the transverse. So Uru Asa LM literally means Stargate. So the war is over the Stargate. The Stargate's broken, so I'm suggesting we cancel the war and instead learn how to make the Stargate. An, Ag, Ur, or Uyghur. So the other useful part of this slide is that the word measurement, me, asa, uru, me is the, I think Sitchin got that right, M-E is the Sumerian Draco term for computer disk. Asa means queen of, Uru, dragon. So when an Asa Uru consults their computer group, they make a measurement. I thought that was cool. But the real point here that you can rethread lots of history was that the Draco, because they evolved in a high radioactive environment, had a greater rate of genetic mutations. And so they got the idea that DNA that changes is defective, which became the caste system in India and Aboriginal marriage law. And and Monsanto. And to prevent DNA from changing, which is a religion in Draco culture, they would engrave the sequence of plasmatoroid domain symmetries, call it Hebrew, onto gold and copper foil, which were genetic symmetry records, in order to prove genetic histories to try to prevent DNA from changing. And so when Joseph Smith, and we'll see that, was learning to interpret the Urim and Thummim from the Mormon genetic records, he actually used a translucent quartz tetra, Urim and Thummim, to index the toroidal domains. You get the flavor. I have a slide about this. And here's, I will raise a Shem unto the Lord. It's all over the Bible. A Shem means access to a black hole, CH, because it's literally how you make a black hole in your throat. The origin of the word shaman, shaman, for example. So access to a black hole, the root of chemistry and alchemy, is raising a Shem unto the Lord, or altar, meant that I will make a phase conjugate node at which longitudinal interferometry is possible. You didn't know that raising a Shem unto the Lord means that, did you? So this is the word Orion. You see the term gold present in origins because of the importance of the gold powder addiction, which was true. I think Sitchin got that right, although the Draco now don't need, because they can make their own now. But at that time, and we show later some of the material they used for gold powder manufacture here. And it's true. He got another piece of the story, right? That the presence of gold in the atmosphere can help with the maintenance of atmosphere, because it's part of what makes it phase conjugate and centripetal, which was the entire trick to planet taming, which is, we don't have the time for that conversation here. So that's what the Shem was called, the Highward Fire Stone, which is more correctly told, we now know means implosive capacitance. So an altar is actually a name for implosive capacitance, and that ability, which is how they did the plasma containment for containing the nukes. And this is the roots of the term seraphim, Ophanim, Ebi, Uru, Urash, the bloodline of Enki. These slides are old. And so the concept of to fall, as the Nephilim here, literally meant a loss of DNA implosion, ensoulment. And the symptoms were loss of ability to take memory through death, loss of ability to lucid dream, and loss of long-term memory in general. This is important to understand the physics of ensoulment. So what did it mean to be fallen? It's pretty important to have a little sense of what that means. So for example, my name, Danny L, means the L from An, Tuatha De Danann. An always meant sun god. And if later we get to see the geometry of the heart of the sun, we'll see the Anu shape, which it was just that perfect slip knot, 7 spins, 5 spins. And the origin term, George, ogre, dragon, which is Celtic, gay ogre literally means world dragon, George. These are our websites about this, and we talk about fusion of the blood here, our origins of repulsion there, and the Anton Parks websites we spoke about. We've got hundreds of articles about this story, which you see there. This is showing that the ancient Hungarian had the same tetracubic symmetry as Hebrew, which again, on Ag-Ur is a Draco alphabet, the dragons of Hungary, as it were. And the name Enki and Enlil are actually frozen into the symmetry of the ancient alphabet of the Hungarian called Rovás-írás, Rovás-írás, which is basically a dragon script. Example, when they found the ancient Draco language carvings in the caves of Senshi in China, which is straight Draco. The only people who could read them who were the ones who knew the ancient Hungarian alphabet, Rovás-írás, actually. It's straight Draco. This is from the Montauk survivor Stuart Swerdlow, graphing his perception of the various extraterrestrials who created the various Earth religions. And this is pretty consistent with our current story. This is old, but still it shows the diaspora from Lyra and the Draco War, and where the humans migrated to, Procyon, Arcturus. Tau Ceti, et cetera, and how that started the religion on there. It's the Egyptian from Hebrew, et cetera. You can see this entire version of the ET history from the Montauk perspective, which fits pretty well this story at goldenmean.info/invasion, and credit to Stuart Swerdlow here. And this that is so well reflected in the language tree, origins of language. It's called Ur-Alic. Well, somebody needs to know who Ur is at the root of the language tree in Ur-Al. Ur-El, and Ur is an ancient Draco, and El is one who can make the phase shift for longitudinal coherence. So this gives you a clue to the language tree of planet Earth. This is the tree structure showing that the family of Enki, Enlil, and Anu were in fact the origins of the names of God in most every ancient religion on the planet came from the same family. So Enki, for example, was called Merk, Merku, Dagon. In Egypt, he was called Atum or Ptah. In Greece, he was called Poseidon. In Babylon, he was called Ea or Zoroaster. In African, he was called Atum or Kilimanjaro. In Christian, he was called Lucifer or Baal, as in Beelzebub. In Norse, he was called Loki. In America, he's called Atum or Tom. Aboriginally, he's called Fish God. In Star Wars, he's called Luke Skywalker. This guy, Enki, really gets around. And you can see who Enlil was, Amun, Zeus, Jupiter, and Michael, George. And Hermes, Thoth, goes around and seeds almost every indigenous culture on the planet. Veracocha, Quetzalcoatl, these are all incarnations of Hermes, Thoth. Thutmosis became the name Thule, which is the name for both Atlantis and which is, Platon's called reptilian, and Thutmosis is the name for the royal line of Egypt because they were all sons of Thoth. and Thoth was called DWD, Tehuti, which later was mistranslated DWD, which became the line of David. So you see how pervasive this one family is in Earth's religious history. It's important to know. And by the way, that's the origin of the Oedipus story, and it goes on and on. And this a royal family story. And so again, we have this chart, which I made years ago, which is still quite useful. It shows the Orion families and the history. This is from the indigenous peoples. So this is called The Return of the Bird Tribes. And I knew Ken Carey quite well at the time he wrote that book, actually. And so we were putting together the Cherokee and the Iroquois, and they all say the ancestors came from Pleiades, and now we know why, et cetera, et cetera. And even the Maori say the same things. And here we're just talking about the alphabetical phenomenon, Enochian becoming John Dee. And so this is the John Dee and Kelly story. And we've done a lot of work on that and how he used the 7 hills of Prague to make the storm that took out the Spanish Armada, later called the Tempest. And he told Queen Elizabeth a year ahead of time he was making that storm. And you can read about the physics of steering tornadoes, goldenmean.info/dowsing. But basically, it has to do with embedding your plasma, bioplasmic streamers into the heart of the tornado. And thus you become its center of gravity because you feel its pain. Eating the chucha. This is showing how the iron atom replaced the magnesium atom when human blood changed from green chlorophyll to red hemoglobin. And that simple one atom replacement changed chlorophyll to hemoglobin. And it's important to understand later when we see the physics of photosynthesis is just phase conjugate. The only 2 colors that make photosynthesis, orange and purple, are exactly the Einstein's plot. Phase conjugate fractality, negentropy, is the only physics reason photosynthesis exists. And it's also the way chlorophyll and hemoglobin work to make fusion in the blood. So the early humans actually had a greenish blood, as did Enki. And this gives you a clue to seeing that. And it's because the humans had to go underground for so many millennia when their blood turned from green to red. This is this slide series is from a lecture about fusion in the blood. This is our early measurement. This is when I proved, actually, Glenn Ryan, at my suggestion, made this measurement. This change in braid density in DNA was measured after the onset of heart coherence, love and bliss. This is the phonon coherence power spectrum, this is 0 to 30 hertz of the EKG at the moment of love, measurably causing DNA to braid implode. Hint, fusion in the blood, the physics of bliss, it's measurable. All at goldenmean.info/DNA manifesto. So here you see that this is a Draco queen here. This is from the ancient statuary Sumerian goddess. This is a Draco queen. And this is from Anna Hayes, a Draco queen. And this is what Enlil looked like, who was basically half Draco. And this is Anton Parks. So this is what Enki looked like. Remember I said he looked like a frog. Why does every statue of Osiris have a green face in all of Egypt? Has anyone else ever answered why? It's important to know. The blood was green. And Enki was something of a hero. He didn't want his cloning, which is what his name was, Newton the cloner, to be used for just slaves and snack food by the Draco family that hired him, his father, who was a military man. And so that, but at the same time, Enki, remember, his name is Sam also. He was a trickster. He was famous for taking some of his best genetic experiments back to fight his wars back in Orion. That's the real story of Enoch. This is just an example. So you get a real practical earthly example. The Iradia couple in Russia, their body mutated to where they needed radiation. Their blood mutated back to Draco blood chemistry, and you can see the story there. And because they lived too close to Chernobyl, and they mutated to a Draco blood chemistry that benefited from radioactivity in the blood. It's actually a stimulant, and that's an example of Draco blood chemistry. Actually, it's a real story, and it's instructive. Blood. This is a Secret of the Dark Stars, Anton Parks, which I think is the best historically researched story of Enki's Uru, Ages of Uras, it's called. And you get a very good description of the branches of the Draco family, much better than Sitchin, whose scholarship I think Anton Park rightfully criticizes. On the other hand, it's important to know that Anton Parks is kind of a forced ambassador for a certain family of the dragon line. So you need to know there's an agenda there as well. But this is a very instructive slide. So here, remember when we found out that the reason the curses on the lips of the dying Aboriginal causes Australia to become a desert, and you heal the male-female ancient wars of the Aboriginals, and rainstorms follow you across the desert of Australia. Well, the separate languages of the male tribe and the female tribe came from Draco. And here is the name of the different languages used by the male versus the female of the Draco. This is the War of the Sexes. You want to know the origin of the War of the Sexes? It's right here. So actually, Joseph Smith had to study the old Egyptian to read the gold foil, the Mormon plates, because of this. The one language called Emesa, from our word emanate, and it was called Emagir. And I have another slide on this, but you see at the bottom, the female language on the bottom became Akkadian, Babylonian, whereas the male language became Sumerian. And that difference becomes very important. You see the War of the Sexes. This slide is too small, but it shows that Anton Parks tracking the bloodline. This is just the picture of the Orion Wars, discontinuity in the spiral arm of the galaxy. The legend has it that this break in this spiral arm of the galaxy is due to the Orion Wars. So the Iroquois told us, you look up and you see the spiral arm broken and you see the history of our war. Actually, this is a picture of the plasma geometry of what is in fact the Orion constellation Mintaka Altak. And you see it is a double light cone, literally Yod and a Vah, Yod He Vah He. And to inhabit that, double vortex light cone made you a big light being, a Yahweh, literally. This is the Ophanim Enochian alphabet and the geometry of 7 spins, 5 spins, which became Ophanim. And this is the application of those letters to make the movie Stargate. This is what a Stargate is. And remember, even the Cherokee had a name for this alphabet. They called it the Adawi. The Ophanim, the whirling ones. Literally, if you learn how to inhabit Stargates, and remember, even Billy Myers knew that if you try to go into a Stargate with the wrong psychology, beam me up, Scotty, only works when you're in a certain frame of mind. And that has to do with the emotional discipline it takes to withstand implosion. This is just a little map from the hypercube letters of the Ophanim Enochian angel alphabet, showing the names of the angels are actually symmetry sequences. Here's Gabriel, Zadkiel, Suniel, Gabriel, Haniel, Mikael. So the angel names are literally symmetry sequences of plasma imploding. Their name and their shape and their service are one. You can read all about this. But at Golden Mean emphasize Ophanim. This is from John Dee's Tablet of Malvage. But I just ask you to think about it for a moment. Who spoke to Mary at the starting Christianity? Gabriel. Who spoke to Joseph Smith, the starting of the Mormons? Gabriel. Who spoke to Muhammad, the starting of the Muslims? Gabriel. What was Gabriel's agenda? Has anybody ever actually asked that question? It was genetic. This is how the Ophanim Enochian alphabet is assembled. It's elements of the symmetry of plasma vortex tubes. We must credit Darlene, Vincent Bridges' partner here, who helped us. And this is from the book, one of my 4 books, Earthheart. You can see my 4 books there at fractalfield.com. And this is if you assemble the letters of that alphabet from Vincent Bridges, you get a hypercube. And now we see that's implosion symmetry, and that's literally how stargates are built. And that relates to the ancient tablets of Hermes and the physics of the caduceus, which today is called phase conjugation. And you even see that in the Bon Po, the Bon Po, or our origin of a bonfire. This is the swastika in pure 4-wave mixing phase conjugate symmetry, making the Bon Po bonfire the letters which became the emerald tablets. So this is a Tibetan legend as well. And this is from the Emerald Tablet stove. And here we're using the pyramid symmetry in gold to cause plants to grow and trigger bliss. This originally was Purify.net, my early invention, which later became Therify.net. And this is a story about Dolman and our Dolman work in Australia, and this is the Ophanim Enochian Stargate. So now I'm going to stop this screen share. And my voice is getting a bit weak here. And do we have questions, or how are we doing time?
Oh, yes, Dan, thank you very much. This was, man, my head is still buzzing. It's, that was a lot. And I recommend very highly that when you were listening to this, go back and listen to this again. Because this talk was on several levels of consciousness. You're going to catch a lot more the second time. If you watch it the third time, you will understand more again. And I think Dan will agree to that. That's probably how it would.
Yeah, I think that one message here is really that, as we think, computers need to run the world, we need to understand that what ultimately steers is the implosion in the plasma vortex itself, which at one level, a plasma vortex implosion is what consciousness is in the brain. It's the net of fireflies. And that plasma vortex can take your vision outside your head at death and dream. And the ability to then know what a soul is literally the only way out of a world dominated by artificial intelligence, which is soullessness. So until we can teach what a soul is, we are condemned to the soulless AI. That's the message here.
Yeah. There's a question here also. Can the plasma technology, implosion technology, or the focused consciousness overcome AI biometrics infused into the genetics of human now after this infusion of this, what should we call it, so-called remedy for the global calamity that is going on? I'm trying to be diplomatic in the language here. Can that help?
Well, we're saying something very practical at a simple level. You know how people who go into a bar and get drunk or use recreational drugs and they get holes in their aura, in those cases, they're much more likely to have astral parasites. It's called astral hygiene. Now, if that person goes and learns some form of bliss process, yoga, tai chi, meditation, some form of bliss process, which is implosive, charge dense, and then charge radiant, those parasites will begin to be burned out. Now, on a much larger level, that's also how planets learn to have astral hygiene. So unfortunately, on this planet, Montauk and the wrong tree with the grays, all of these things made plasma holes in our planet and invited more parasites in. And, there's a natural feedback mechanism with parasites that we must learn the physics of the way out of parasitism, and this physics is quite simple. At the center of the implosion, we call bliss, charge radiance. As the charge waves converge at the Planck threshold, that charge density is inhabitable only by a shareable wave, that is pure intention. And that's the point at which all forms of parasite are toasted if you have access to some sort of bliss. Now, as that problem gets bigger and bigger, black goo and galaxy parasites, this is the Luke Skywalker story.
Yeah, and here's a question also. And are you feeling on if and when one can safely use the gold ormus, white powdered gold? Can that be done safely as maybe a tool to advance into what you're talking about?
When Thoth narrated the exercises to enable eating gold powder without fractionation of personality, like even if you had too much microhydrin, you had a much shorter attention span. That's an example. The truth is that the more organic the source of the ormes, the safer it is. So agricultural ormes derived from deep seawater, that's some wonderful stuff. And when I introduced Chaz, who became the gold powder maker for Pat Flanagan, a good friend, which then became priestessalchemy.com. That's some wonderful organically derived materials. So there are ways not to burn your aura if you can use this successfully. And actually, any form of externally administered implosive charge density ultimately can be good or bad only if, and I give you the example, Therify.net, that plasma, yes, you will have a buzz, you'll have spin, you'll have some euphoria, and you'll have sharpened vision often. But if you do not do grounding and hydration, you get fractionation, you get too much buzz, your thoughts speed up and you can't handle it. So grounding and hydration are the only way really to embed that added spin. And the physics grounding is access to fractality, which gives you phase reference to, and thus actually leverage the bigger tornado. So read the book Earthing.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm familiar with the priestesalchemy.com because I know the guy pretty well. And in fact, I got some of his white powdered gold in this medal that I've been carrying around my neck.
No, he's quite an alchemist.
Yeah. Yeah. And also there was a question here. Could you give us an idea when we talked about the technology that you have that'll do some of the same thing as the med beds? Where can they find that? Are there some of those in the US that someone can go and try?
Therify.net, Thera, Therify, PHI.net, Therify.net. We're in 25 countries. There's 20 or 30 of them in the United States and 12 or 20 states, and we're all over the place. And yes, by all means, try it. It's plasma charge for the aura. For example, localized pain we can usually deal with in one session. Long-term or chronic pain, we can help many, but not all, but it takes, sessions over a week or two, et cetera, et cetera. And there's response to all kinds of disease issues simply from charging your aura. We don't make medical claims, but it's not illegal to charge your aura directly with life force. And you can read hundreds of stories of success there, therify.net.